Less than a week ago, here at this very podium, a poet read a line attributed to life itself, or perhaps death. Why did you keep a travel diary when I was always by your side? Which reminded me of a line I'd heard Rosmarie Waldrop read in a neighboring room here this year. She is in travels, capital T, which is an English language translation of the Narragansett phrase meaning childbirth or labor, which is a way of saying we are in the midst of the generative tonight. We are having our existence. We are in travels. This means something nobody knows, Keith Waldrop writes, and may not leave here knowing the more of, only differently posited. In a talk he gave here last week, the choreographer Will Rawls said that choreography, which means to write down dance, is a writing that, quote, needs to unravel instead of to secure. I cite him and the travels and the vectors of voices that have impinged on this very space, the intervals they've introduced, as a kind of opening to the porous journey work or collective excursion of this oral history, which is really, let's face it, only a variation on the extensive and ongoing oral history, which is every single conversation the two figures in this room tonight have had or heard since they met in 1954. Rather than seeking to fill the room with story, our hope is to open it to the unraveling of and reveling in spaces they've generated and explored, persons and communities and questions they've intersected with and or formed the vital or fleeting center of, and or assisted into circulation through their 5 decades-long experimental press, Burning Deck, many of which books we have on display tonight. Tonight is also a kind of be-in, an invitation to you also to contribute when you care to your own stories about the Waldrops as distinct individuals or as continuously collaborative and adjacent couple. To get us started, I've asked the Waldrop's dear friend Steve Evans to introduce and moderate. Unless you think I'm going to leave it at that, here's a little sense of his own interconnectivity to the couple in question. Steve Evans first became aware of the Waldrops in the pages of Temblor when he was an undergraduate at UC San Diego, where he was also a student, I might add, of Fanny Howe, sitting in the second row there, who's here. A few years later, when he and his partner, the poet Jennifer Moxley, also here, moved to Providence in 1989, Michael Davidson kindly provided a letter, not an email, of introduction. At Brown, Evans took a seminar on the objectivist poets taught by Rosmarie Waldrop. Fellow students, incidentally, included Maggie Zarowski and Peter Gizzi. He also studied the likes of Charles Williams and David Jones with Keith Waldrop. According to Evans, quote, adventures shared during a year spent together in the 15th arrondissement of Paris made the friendship between the couples permanent. I should add that tonight we grieve the burning of Notre Dame in Paris. Please welcome beloved friend of the Waldrops, inimitable scholar, and chair of English at the University of Maine, Steve Evans.
Thank you, Christina. Thank you all for being here. It probably would best unfold if we could reimagine this space as the smaller, book-built living room of Keith and Rosmarie Waldrop at 71 Elm Grove. I don't know what Harvard's built of. Their house is literally built of books and supported somewhat with CDs and vinyl records. It is a space of incessant making. It is a space that very early on when they moved there, they sent out to their friends at Christmas time a chapbook that ended with the words, hoping for visitors. So it is a space in many ways utterly unique to them. It's hard to imagine two other creatures coming up with exactly the same architectural solution. Think of a Kurt Schwitter's bow, you know. And yet it is a space through which so many of us have passed and taken away these incredible, indelible impressions usually at first of one's own insignificance and ignorance, being gently handled by people of tremendous learning who blend, as Erin Coonan has said, an intensity toward the life of poetry with a deep and abiding irreverence that makes it always a pleasure to be in the room with them. The other big difference is we would have a very good bottle of wine that Rosmarie would have opened last night, and there would be snacks all around, and rather than dashing through 60 or 75 minutes with one another, we would be on a marathon that likely would begin a little before dinner and wrap up when Jennifer and I had exhausted them utterly, which is very hard to do. It is ironic. Athletics not the first thing that comes to mind with the Waldrops, so the Boston Marathon has to be understood metaphorically here. They've run many poetic marathons, never in daylight, and they've always declined to win. That's the way they are. Winning is so boring and lonely. And the sense of today as Patriots Day makes me wonder what possible country they would be patriots of. I'd like to go there. I'd like to stay there. 71 Elm Grove is as near to it as I've seen. I don't know if people have literally sought refuge there, as Assange did in Ecuador, but it's definitely a rip in the space-time continuum that, and no flags particularly to salute. And then it's tax day for other people, the ones who don't have this little regional vanity about the day. And it gets me thinking about publishing and translation as unremunerated work. It's not that you aren't paid back through community and through enlightenment and painstaking labors, but really publishing and translating are effacing arts, and they seldom bring the refund. So that's my take on April 15th as this day. I know Christina had some trepidation about programming on it, but Patriots Day Marathon, we've got it all covered, taxes too. Keith has agreed to read a couple short poems, and then Rosmarie will as well, so that their voices are in the room immediately, and their voices as artists. And then we're going to move into a conversation that's organized roughly around a couple of ideas. One, that of the rhythms of making, including the rhythms of making art, but also of making days and making lives. Also thinking about the tremendous variety of practices that go into a Waldropian day, the many forms of making, whether that be collage, visual or verbal, the reading practices that are incessantly going on in the background, the translation work, the work down in the basement at the press. Each of these endeavors, I think any one of us would feel pretty good about having done by the end of the day. They seem always to interlace and fill the Waldropian space in a way that I think it's worth thinking about. How you could be so industrious with nothing resembling a work ethic is one of the primary enigmas of Keith and Rosmarie Waldrop. They never look like they've done anything. And yet, when I was compiling a little cheat sheet for myself before today's event, I'm a department chair, so I live on spreadsheets. I made one column for Rosmarie and one column for Keith, and I filled it out. It's 140 lines, and I just dashed that out in a day or two. So there's such an enormous play ethic as opposed to work ethic, and that might be something that we can talk about. There are some places and some people that we've marked out as wanting to discuss, and then there's things that will arise as they may. But Keith, if you would read a little from the selected, that would be a great first start.
I knew they were somewhere. I'll read two poems. One is slightly over a page, but they're very short lines, so it's not very long. And the other is 2 lines. They have similar sounding titles. Proposition 1. Sunlight, yes, I mean it's there. Things separate, my eyes smart. Dark, indefinite something. Two knowledges. One, not to stumble. Two, not to move. Look on tiptoe, listen horizontal, breath held. Under 60 watts, right. What can I lure here? Proposition 2. Each grain of sand has its architecture, but a desert displays the structure of the wind. Thank you.
Well, I'll read one that's more chatty. And it ties right into what Steve was saying, because the title is Doing. So, doing. I often don't know what to do, or if I want to. Dawn has long broken while I still drag my feet in the mud inside my head, hope for coffee, make a B-flat moan, to prepare the plunge into action. Or not. Maybe I want to cast only a passing shadow, feel like my mother's thank God when she took off her corset. But I'm worried there's something I ought to be doing, afraid I'll die without having done anything, realized myself, you call it. But wouldn't that just mean limited myself? A cement mixer stuck in one motion, even if it helps build a house? So I delude myself into thinking I'm doing something when thinking, or when descending into the night with the cat and the dreams of the cat. You say, no doing without sweat of the face, thorns and thistles, and bringing forth children. Should I look instead of worrying about fine distinctions that escape my eyes? Listen instead of fretting about the size of my ears? But can I cultivate my garden without becoming a cabbage head? The hand gets ready to write. Could we not call this manual labor? Or a stage in the great work of rendering the corporeal cat incorporeal while giving her body to the bodiless word, even if it's from despairing of my own body? You say, my writing is so slow it's more like gravitational condensation or dust gathering on the cleaning supplies. It's true, I'm dawdling as if I had time to watch the formation of geological layers, so night already seeps through my brittle bones. I certainly don't know what to do to end my days gracefully. But the body dies all through our life, thousands of cells every second. So everything should be very clear. Thank you.
Thank you both. Bringing forth of children reminds me of the great French poet Jacques Roubaud's remark that through some of their collaborative work, Keith and Rosmarie had created the troisième Waldrop, the third Waldrop, refraining from mere biological reproduction, but creating literary effects. And one way that you get to the third Waldrop is through their collaborative work, but it's also through the traditional techniques of juxtaposition. And so I thought I would just juxtapose two quick statements, one by Keith and one by Rosmarie. The train of thought was set off by the fact that this university is generously accommodating us this evening in a hotel whose Latin title translates as truth. Keith says, I know it is true because we're on the ground floor and you can hear the capital T. I think Plato may have been on the right track, Keith says, that poetry is not mainly concerned with truth. I would say that if the formal interest of a poem is not greater, or it's not equal or greater than its interest as message, it's not good poetry. And I'd extend it even to novels. Many writings get noticed for their immediate relevance and then, when their occasion is gone, fade away. Others shine only when their first purpose is no longer there to distract from their artistic worth. The non-aesthetic elements of a work, its content, its occasions, go deep and are therefore, in the long run, trivial. Of course, they're necessary to the existence of the work, as the inner organs of an animal are necessary to its life. But life isn't much of a point. There is nothing more horrible than mere life. The life that matters, lived life, is lived on the surface. What is significant happens on or between surfaces. The skin is our territory. Guts are supporting structures. When our bodies are working well, the inner organs go unnoticed. They can't, in fact, survive except secretly, covered by a protecting surface. Hard to say which is worse, a gutless poem or a poem with guts exposed. All we see is surface. Strictly speaking, all we see is an edge. To see anything at all, we have to keep our eyes moving. My writing is concerned with the self-evident, the givens of experience, but it's more concerned with the ground than with the figure. It points to transitions, edges from which we infer things, and a world of things. The ground is what we haven't yet noticed, because we're looking at a figure already in focus. It's not invisible, merely unseen. Profound wouldn't seem to me a compliment. Not that anybody is likely to apply the word to my writing. And next to that, I want to put a passage from Ceci n'est pas Rosmarie, one of the paired autobiographies that they wrote in 1997 at the bequest of Gale Literary something or another.
Yeah, right.
Lots of poets we knew wrote their autobiographies in this season, and Keith and Rosmarie's are bundled together as Ceci n'est pas Keith and Ceci n'est pas Rosmarie, charming gentlemen on the front, self-evidently not either of them. Rosmarie is thinking in this passage about the years in Providence. They seem round, filling the whole space, like whales in smooth, hipless motion. Simple time open toward quiet, persistent love, friends, reading, writing, black dots across the screen. To pinpoint events not as easy as in the times abroad, memories keyed to place. I like the image in Don Quixote that compares translation to working on a tapestry. You sit behind the canvas with a mess of threads and a pattern for each color. You follow out patterns, but you have no idea what image will appear on the other side. This holds for living as well, step by single step. And for writing, I don't even have thoughts. I have methods that make language think, take over, and me by the hand. Into sense or offense, syntax stretched across rules, relations of force, fluid, the dip of the plumb line, the pull of eyes. I love the image of that tapestry worked from behind, and Keith and Rosmarie share an interest in that relationship between figure and ground, and what is there to be noticed but hasn't yet been noticed. And I think the practice is insistently returning to that vacillation between figure and ground. So one of the things when I brought up yesterday with Rosmarie by way of prepping today, I said, well, I'd like to talk about rhythms, and she was sort of like, why? And as we were exploring the concept, it occurred to me that when we were living together in Paris, we would take a walk of some number of blocks, and it would always be Rosmarie and me up in front, and then at some point we'd turn around and realize that Keith and Jennifer were dawdling 3 blocks behind, deep in a conversation or lost in a window or something like that. And it got me to thinking about idiorhythmy and the way that we pace ourselves and the way that those images of stepping together work. And by an odd... So the first fact to know about the Waldrops, Rosmarie articulated over breakfast this morning when the phone rang. She said, nobody who knows us would call in the morning. And their households have been legendary for observing non-standard times. And we can talk a little bit about that. But one thing that struck me is when we got to talking about rhythm and we got to talk about the way poets work a line, and so we're going to talk about Robert Creeley in a minute, but what emerged is that these two awesome poets both view as almost transcendental rhythmic figures Henry James, in whose vicinity I guess we're currently right now sitting, according to Dan Bouchard, and Robert Musil. So prose writers...
And Robert who?
Musil, man without qualities.
Right.
And so these prose works and their rhythms, they're intricately worked, layered, metaphor-studded. The space of those two authors in my mind, I thought that it'd be good to start from before we go into the community of lived experiences. Keith, you seem to have taken late Henry James as a aspiration, a model, just a pleasure.
Can you say a little more? Can you say a little more?
Thank you.
So it's the Golden Bowl and the Ambassadors. These are the late James that you return to?
Oh, yes. All of Henry James.
Yes, every once in a while Keith gets grumpy and says, I haven't read any Henry James for a while. I need to do that. Yeah.
Okay, well, we'll draw you out more on it. It seemed that Ezra Pound said of American poets that they'd have to be at least as good as Henry James going forward, so maybe that's some of the spirit. And Rosmarie, Musil as a touchstone?
Oh, yes. Well, it's a great novel, but and also very funny, because in case you don't know it, it's all these people in 1913 making a big plan to celebrate Austria's something 100th anniversary of something, which would fall in 1918. Meanwhile, we know, nobody's going to be celebrating in 1918. But so there are all these, so it becomes a satire of institutions, state, everything. But beside that, there were particularly two things that struck me. And one is his main character is called Ulrich, and he's called the man without qualities. And he has the idea that what people call character is actually the most impersonal thing we have, because it's the traits that get reinforced from the outside. And so our true self is really to have no qualities that anybody could hold on to. And that rang very true to me. Yeah. And the other thing is that the whole novel is sort of built on really a questioning of the narrative line. he every once in a while will say something, or he will build nets of statements. For instance, he goes on for at least a page and a half saying, on a certain day, the barometer was at this, and the temperature was that, and the humidity was there. And it goes on and on and on. And at the end, he says, in short, it was a nice August day in 1913. And this playing a web against the line, I thought was such a great thing. And that has influenced me tremendously, Yeah.
That sense of going back to somebody like Juna Barnes or Kafka or Musil or James.
Right.
I just wanted to give some acknowledgement to the genre peculiarity of two poets depending so reliably on two great prose writers.
On prose writers. Yeah, but good writing is good writing, whether it's in prose or in verse.
Well, that makes an easy segue to somebody that we wanted to talk about because he was an early revelation to you and then ended up being a colleague at Brown University towards the end of his career. And so talking about Robert Creeley might make sense for a minute here.
Oh, right.
And you mentioned in your memoir the effect of first encountering Creeley. So could you put a little context to?
Yes. We were still graduate students in Ann Arbor, Michigan. But Keith was teaching at Wayne State that year, replacing, in fact, W.D. Snodgrass, who was on leave. But with this job came a budget for a little poetry festival. And so Keith invited Robert Duncan, Robert Creeley, and Keith, was there anybody else?
It won't come to me at the moment. I can't think of the name.
Yeah.
There was a third person, it's true.
Yeah, well, these two, I think, were most important to both of us. So
Usually that would be Charles Olson, right? So you forget him.
No, he was not there. No. But hearing Creeley read was a revelation to me because, here was somebody who really read the line ends. There was an enormously long pause at the end of every line. I think in his later life he did that less, but in these early days it was very startling. And yet the poem, was not. He wasn't dropping it. It kept being suspended, but there was that pause. He made that pause. He made the line ending audible, and that was incredible. That was a revelation, and how important the line endings are, and how important it is to let the silence into the text, which the line ending does, And so that was great. And actually, I like very much at what he said at some later time when I had a reading in Buffalo and he came to it. And I told him afterwards how important he had been to me. And he said, oh, we all learn from one another, which was a sort of great brushing it off. Yeah.
And you did a little translation of him into German at that time, or attempted?
Oh, that was very early.
Yeah.
That was right after I came, and I found I couldn't continue writing in German while speaking and thinking in English. And so I thought I would translate, and first translated from English into German. So I translated a few of his poems and sent them to a German magazine. But I gave that up fairly soon and switched to the other direction. Yeah.
Keith, I wanted to ask you about something Erin Coonan says in his... Erin Coonan's written a wonderful introduction to this brand spanking new volume from Wave that is a compendium called Keeping the Window Open. And it really is the Madeleine's for an event like this. We could go through this book page by page and never tire of it. You can see, for instance, the 4 chapters and appendix of Keith's dissertation on obscenity and pornography, which I've heard about forever but never saw a title page on until now. But Erin suggests in his brilliant introduction that this book offers an instruction manual of how to become the Waldrops. I can't imagine them recommending that. I know that in our life we sometimes do something and we say, oh, Waldropification. But he says that you took a lesson from Edmond Jabès, the great French writer, that you didn't have to choose between being serious and not being serious. And I just love that.
That's right, yes.
Can you say more about that?
That's exactly enough. It wasn't a matter of being serious or funny. You could do all these things at once. It doesn't matter. You didn't have to decide what sort of thing you were going to say. You just say it. And it could be any one thing, but it could be any one thing that would include all of them. You just go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I'm grateful to you for helping give Cano to me. I love his journals and other writings, and it was you who first talked about it. When I was thinking about last thought on rhythm, is a lot of what turns something from serious to non-serious or to humorous is timing. And even in those very short poems that you just opened the event by reading, there's real humor in the space between these serious propositions. And then your handling of anecdote in your work makes you kind of somewhat of a student of W.C. Field and other people. There's a lot of comedic tension and timing in that.
W.C. Fields is a hero of mine.
I don't think I've heard you say that, but okay. Very few heroes in this guy's list. The humor in your work, Rosmarie, often seems to be the humor of the small change that makes a big difference. So like blind sight, or take just one small phonemic change that changes fundamentally the meaning, or adding an N to the word law and coming up with lawn, which seems a useful concretization of something that seems very abstract and fierce. And so something to think about more. I think sometimes the amount of learning and productivity that you two bring into the world is at first glance intimidating to people, so that it doesn't come equipped with the laughter that I've always associated with you two. It seems sometimes a shame, but it's there in the work, you know? They're like, he's characterizing me. This is not okay.
Well, puns are a great thing.
You seem to delight in puns more than Keith does. Yes. Yeah. Let's back up a little for folks in the room who aren't familiar with the biography. I was thinking one thing that seems to draw you together is that you have no apparent allegiance to state or family. And that's not to say that those two things aren't threads in your work, but you, Rosmarie, stepped away from a childhood in Hitler's Germany and came to America at a fairly young age. Keith, you made it out of Kansas and never understood the Wizard of Oz thereafter, for why would you ever want to return to Kansas? And you seem to, you found each other partly because of Keith's service in the mid-50s in the American Army. Mm-hmm. Rosmarie, why don't you tell he's your Marshall Plan?
Well, we met in my hometown in Germany, where Keith was stationed in the army, and but there was only a couple months, and then Keith was sent back to the U.S. But we conspired to study together at the University of Aix-Marseille the next year, and during the Christmas vacation, we decided to hitchhike and look at all the cathedrals we had just heard about in a course on Gothic and Romanesque cathedrals. And what we hadn't paid any attention to was what was going on in the world elsewhere. It happened to be the Suez Crisis. And so we were standing by the road with our thumbs out, and there were no cars because nobody had gasoline. So, we wondered, why are there no cars? And then a car drove up, and it was a medical doctor who had gasoline because of his profession. And so he said, you little idiots, what are you trying to hitchhike, at this moment? And then sort of, wondered who we were and how come we were so out of it. And at some point, when it came out that that I had met Keith when he was a soldier in the American Army, he turned around and said, "Oh, so he's your Marshall Plan,"
That's such a great anecdote. And he wasn't only your Marshall Plan, he also brought over the wonders of phonography. And so I feel for Christina's Woodbury Room team, we need to talk about Keith Waldrop's record player, which was sort of his Cyrano de Bergerac machine, apparently. So Keith, can you talk a little bit about that contraption and then how it turned into a device for smuggling pornography?
Well, what?
I'll come back to that one. Talk about your record player.
Record player. Well, I carried it with me across the ocean and back, and if I wanted to hide something to bring it back into the States, I would stick it into the machine. And Rosmarie thought I was being silly about this, and they were going to look through everything, but they did. They went through absolutely everything, but they didn't take the thing apart and find what they would have considered pornography, I guess.
It was Henry Miller and various other Olympia Press books.
I like, too, that Rosmarie already had a sophisticated theory of smuggling. They disagreed about how to smuggle. But the origin of this story is that Keith, while stationed in the service outside the town where Rosmarie was growing up, had a record player, and that record player was rare enough that people would come to hear records when Keith played them. So there's a very disappointed beau in Rosmarie's past who went from the youth orchestra to losing out to the record player. Yep.
Technology wins out.
Edison for the win, so we can go back to that one. The other big change was that when Keith was in the service, he had short hair and was and nothing on his face, which none of us have ever seen since. And so when you met up in X, Keith presented a different visage to you,
Yes. Yeah? Yes, I happened to be at the top of a stair, and there comes Keith, but not the Keith I had known, but, like this, beard, long hair. And I had a moment of, being unsure that was him.
And with her reaction, I thought, oh, maybe I just should turn around and go home.
And shave. Well, when we were talking this over, too, we came across a pair of scissors, barber scissors, with a nice little curl, and Keith said, "Those are the $1,000 scissors." And Rosmarie said, "Those are the only ones where you can cut his hair with." So we can get into, over drinks, we can get into Keith's Samson complex. But as William Carlos Williams says at Harvard, "But I don't want to get into it here." That's when he was discussing the plums so cold. I've been psychoanalyzed. So you made it to Ann Arbor, and then you made it to Ann Arbor, Rosmarie. And among that company, there's so many deep friendships that have been celebrated in the 20 and 40-year anniversaries of Burning Deck and that are richly documented. It's almost just at random that I would want to know a little bit about Gordon Mumma, because it feels to me like that approach to music and performance just became an abiding thread for you? He was your friend first, Keith?
Yes. Oh, yes. When I got to Ann Arbor, he was working in the bookstore that I went to. He was he was there taking the money and giving you the books and so forth. And I gradually found out that he was more interesting than that. And I forget why he came over to my place at once. I think I had left something at the store, and he wanted to bring it to me. And I was living in one room up on a second floor someplace, and he managed to come up the fire escape or somewhere. I don't know how he got up there, and knocked on the window, and I looked out, and there he was, and
Keeping the window open.
and so he said, so I got him to come in, and he looked around, and he decided that I was a poet. It hadn't occurred to him before. And it hadn't occurred to me either very, very strongly, but we got along very well after that, and he was very good at it. He still is a very good poet, by the way.
Huh.
He's very good.
And the Once festivals?
Pardon?
The Once festivals began there, and am I right to think that that's some of the energy behind what you go on to do?
The composers there wanted to have a little concert, and they said this in my presence, and I said, no, you mustn't do that. You mustn't have a little thing like that. What you want to do is announce that this is a festival, and it's going to go on for year to year. And so they thought about that. They said, "Oh, come on," and then they thought about it a while. And maybe that wasn't such a bad idea. And so the first one was 2 or 3 concerts over a period of a week or so. But then that went over extremely well, not because of my suggestion, but because they had this wonderful music. They were great. They were really good composers, and very unusual for their time. They were first-rate people. You would later you would think they were some of the better people of the sort, but they were also the first people. They were the first ones of that sort, and so they started this, and I was always in good. They always liked me because I had started. I had nothing to do with the festival after that. Rosmarie played the flute or something.
In the very first one.
But
I wasn't really up to the music at all. I really massacred my part, I'm afraid.
So
they found
tried,
a better flutist after that.
I tried over many years to play various instruments, and I was always a flat failure. I just no matter what it was, I could, if it were a horn, I could make some kind of sound come out of the side, but it wasn't the sound I wanted at all, or anybody wanted. And nothing worked whatsoever. And it's one of the great failures of my life that I would not be able to be a musician. Also, I tried to singing, and that was really bad.
But actually,
You were a record player.
Right.
The record player was good.
Rosmarie?
The once concerts very quickly got very much bigger. The first year it was just the local composers, but then they brought John Cage, they brought Berio from Italy, they brought Merce Cunningham. And so suddenly, in this backwater in Michigan, we had a chance to encounter all this avant-garde art. It was amazing.
John Cage was a wonderful friend. He was wonderful.
Say a little more about that, Keith.
He just he from the first time we met him, he knew exactly where he was going, and I kept wondering what he could do next, and he didn't seem to wonder at all. He just did the next thing, and it was just marvelous. It wasn't the same thing, but it was better. It was just he just went on, and he died fairly young. But he was a great.
And he must have been a presiding spirit in the Wesleyan phase of your life.
Yes.
Yeah. And when you went to Wesleyan, that Cagean aesthetic was pretty strong in the 60s.
Yes.
And he was actually in residence for a year at the Center of Advanced Studies at Wesleyan.
Yeah.
And the first time we had dinner with him was a disaster, because
Mushrooms?
Pardon?
Mushrooms involved?
No, the food was fine. It was at an architect's house who taught at Wesleyan, and there was a group of maybe 10, 12 people. And, dinner was fine, but after dinner, when I thought, now we can all really talk, the host suggested that we all play 20 questions. And John Cage sort of chuckled and said, well, why not? And so we sat around playing 20 questions instead of having a chance to talk to John Cage.
I want to do a footnote on the music scene in Ann Arbor. And so your name before you married was?
Sebald, like WG.
And the Weigum?
That was my mother's maiden name, was Wohlgemuth.
Wohlgemuth. So I just have to do this because I'm the Robert Mueller of the Wohlgemuth part of these guys' lives, and it's my life work to prove that they invented Wohlgemuth. But we won't get into that here either. Keith claims to have been in a room with him, so
Wohlgemuth was a real person. He was.
We sleep in.
When I met him, I was much younger than I am now, and he was about the age that I am now, and he died soon after. And nobody had paid any attention to him, but I claimed he was very good, and he got noticed here and there shortly before he died, but still he hasn't got his due yet. He was a very fine artist.
Well, this doesn't really sum it up, but it's too long a story. However, one of the notices that Keith mentioned is that Robert Ashley, who was one of the composers we met in Ann Arbor at that time, has set that the text of Wohlgemuth to music. And it is available as a CD, so you can actually have, hear what the text is like. It's like no other.
Yeah. So I want to get you guys to Providence before too long. In the Wesleyan period, the music program seemed important, and Keith did an amazing commemoration of the 50th year anniversary of Dada, though how that was exactly determined seems hard to me to know. And Wesleyan, you were in Middleton about How long all told? 3-4 years?
7 years at least.
7 years at least.
About 7 years.
No, from 64 to 68. And I was there till 70, but you, I commuted.
Longer than I was.
I commuted to, while you were already in Providence, I commuted for another couple of years. So, well.
So that felt maybe more of a passageway, but the next big world-turning thing seemed to be Keith landing a position in Providence, and shortly thereafter, you're both being able to go to Paris together.
Right.
So can we talk about the Paris part a little bit, and about your friendships with Anne-Marie Albiach and Claude Journeau?
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, we both got grants in 71.
And Alexander von Humboldt.
Yes.
Mystical marriage.
Right. And once we were in Paris, we actually at first didn't try to meet anybody because, the city was sort of enough, just walking around. But very shortly, a former student of Keith's tracked us down. It was George Tisch, who was working in a gallery in Paris at that time, and he came to say hello, and also said, "You have a nice big living room. Can we do poetry readings here?" And we said, "Sure." And so shortly after, he brought by a Canadian poet, Robert Hébert, and I forget who the other one was. Anyway, there was this poetry reading, and Claude and Anne-Marie Albiach came, Claude Journeau and Anne-Marie Albiach. And after the reading, we had some wine, and Claude looked around our books, which were lined up on the floor along the walls, because we didn't have bookshelves. And so he said, I was talking to Keith, said, "Did you bring all these books?" And Keith said, no, we've been buying these since we're here. And Claude was very impressed. But then he spotted Jabès's Book of Questions, the 3 volumes of it, and said, "And this also you just bought?" And Keith said, "Well, no, actually that we brought because Rosmarie has started translating it and brought it along to work some more on in case her own work doesn't go well." At which point, Claude shot across the room to me and kissed me and said, "I must kiss you because you're translating Jabès." And it turned out that Jabès was a good friend of his, and he rushed to the phone and called him up, but this was maybe 10 at night, and Edmond went to bed at 8:30 at the latest. So that was nothing, but the very next day, he brought Edmond by. And so I gave him the 50 pages that I had translated at that point. And he later, came back with them and said he recognized himself in the rhythm, which made me very happy and also made me immediately continue the translation, while I had him there to ask questions. But so
Now
that
you've done how many of his books?
about 14. Yeah, but so the Anne-Marie, Claude, and the Jabèses we became really very close friends, and Claude and Anne-Marie were both on the verge of having a first book. In fact, Anne-Marie's first book was published the day of that poetry reading. And Claude told us, today is that publication date. So after they all left, we went to the drugstore, which is not at all like an American drugstore, but had a big bookstore section. And there was Anne-Marie's État, which we bought, and Keith started translating that. And Claude and Anne-Marie, I admired that they were very clear about their theoretical positions, which both amazed me because I work more intuitively, and I'm always muddling through, and it's maybe after I've written something, or maybe at best halfway through, that I sort of realize what I'm doing. But they had a program, and that was Shall We Escape Analogy. It was a reaction against the surrealists, and they're heaping up all these images. And so they wanted a very sober poetry of statement, of simple things. And that was very interesting to me also, partly because I had started writing a sequence in which the metaphors were sort of pushed out into the structure. I was sort of talking and walking in parallel, but never sort of saying, in any way, talking is like walking or walking is like talking. But it's sort of there in the background. And so that really rang a bell with me when they started talking about this and said, oh, I've been sort of moving in that direction. So they also helped me clarify my work, And, well, it was an immensely fruitful friendship.
And Rosmarie began translating Edmond at that time. Keith began translating both Anne-Marie and Claude Royer-Journoux, so has brought all of Claude's work into American English and much of Anne-Marie's. It sounds as though you and Anne-Marie, your two couples, had a recognition of friendship and of ways of working. We were talking today about how the conversations would be so good that the last metro would have gone by at 1, right. And so what else could we do but stay up till 6, and then sleep until 2, which then Edmond Jabès would frown upon. And so that's where the translation dug in earnest, it seems like, and from then on, you've never not been translating. Even though I guess the technical end dates for Série d'écriture and for Dichtung equals were 2017. Is that right? The translation series I'm talking about.
No, they started in the 90s.
Right, but I see an end on the other side these days. It says
yes,
2017.
Yes.
Yeah. Keith, I can't remember if it was the 20th or the 40th anniversary of Burning Deck, but one of the most memorable tributes to Keith and Rosmarie was the moment where Claude Royer-Journoux, having flown over from Paris, stood in a crypt, I believe it was, where that reading was taking place, and just wept. He could not read a word of poetry. It was astonishing, and it was just so heartfelt. Keith, do you remember being in the audience that day? When Claude attempted to read for you guys, but just kind of couldn't keep composure?
Yeah, I remember. Yeah, I remember that it was very difficult. I didn't know what to do, whether to get up and read it myself or that didn't seem quite right. But yeah, I forget what did happen finally. I remember the problem, but I don't remember how it was solved.
I don't either.
If it was.
I think he caught himself, after a few.
Yeah. Well, it's a great friendship. And I suppose we should also note, just because of the recency of his passing, Emmanuel Hocard's role in that whole community as a fellow translator and a prodigious translator of American poetry into French. Rosmarie, you did his Test of Solitude and one other book, I think.
A small chapbook. I forget the title now.
And the last piece on that before we move to Providence and start to think about opening things to the room is, I distinctly remember you saying that Jacques Roubaud had written a book that you shouldn't translate because it was just too hard. It was the one about the city changing faster than one's love for a city. And about a year later, we came to your house, and there you were busily translating Jacques Roubaud, the book that seemed ill-advised to translate. So.
Well, that was because I persuaded Keith to come in on the project. And we thought, well, it was a fat book, and it was a bit daunting. But we thought if we both work on it, we might manage, and we did.
And we put that together. Yeah, we finally did it. Yes, Rosemarie translated more than I did, but I did the parts that were in formal lines, and some of the last things. But Rosemarie translated more of it than I did. But
The third Waldrop made the translation.
It's a big book, which we did together.
Those of you who don't know Keith's translations of both Flowers of Evil and Paris Spleen, both on Wesleyan, really interesting, comparable to John Ashbery's great translation of Rimbaud's Illuminations, maybe in terms of just the clarity it brings. So we better get to Providence and kind of dig in there. And you say, Rosemarie, in your autobiography that Providence is hard because it's the longest duration, so things sort of seem to even out. But there are lots of lovely stories of the people who've moved through that community. Hannah Weiner was there for a spell.
Oh, yes.
Can we talk about Michael Gizzi for a moment or two?
Sure, yeah. Well, he was Keith's student, of course. He was there as an undergraduate and then stayed for the writing program, for the graduate writing program. And
Yes, when we moved to Providence, because I'd been hired to work on the writers in the school there. He was already working there, and that was a great meeting. It was one of the great collaborations that just happened by perfectly accident that he was there at the time, and I came, and when I read what he was doing, I thought, oh my goodness, and so I started trying to do it, and it was a great part of my life to be involved in that translation.
well, Michael had such an incredible vocabulary that even in conversation, it was just wild. And also Keith and he, of course, hit it off because they both loved operas. And Michael was always, in fact, singing snatches from Italian operas. And but I remember very fondly that Michael once showed me the power of poetry. And this was this way. One time, Keith was at school teaching, and I heard this incredible noise in front of our house. And so I looked out, and there was Michael Gizzi in the tree, up in the tree with a chainsaw, lopping off the dead branches. And I said, Michael, what are you doing up there? And he shouted down, last night's poetry reading showed me that Keith really cares about these trees. So I said, I must do something about them.
He was a tree doctor who broke his back several times in his line of work, I'm afraid. But, yeah.
Right, but that was the only time I was shown the power of poetry.
I think of Michael, too, as part of a triangle that included Jeff Young, who published The Figures, and of Clark Coolidge and that great friendship.
Yes.
So the Coolidge must have been in Providence upon arrival as well because of his dad teaching on the faculty.
His dad taught in the music school, yeah. But I think he was already either on the West Coast or in Massachusetts by the time we came.
Yeah.
And he would come back occasionally. Yeah, but he was already in the East, in the West at that time.
Christina asked that we turn at around this time, to the well, we can keep on, stay in Providence a little longer? Not at all. So Providence is also the space. I've seen you improvise workspaces in Paris and other places, but here's the house that's made for all these different kinds of work. And the Burning Deck really takes root there. And I was thinking that it's it's easy to mark people by places, but Burning Deck in a way is a place, and it assembles a kind of Creeley style company of fellow writers, and those fellow writers might be students who just graduated the MFA at Brown. They might be people like Meme Bersenbrugge or Lynn Hegenian, whose major first works were on that press. And so do you want to talk a little bit about your sense of that table over there? And there's 57. Christina said we could stay here now till midnight.
Yeah. Well, I guess we're just stubborn. So we just kept doing it.
When you ask Keith and Rosemarie about their long marriage, Rosemarie says, lack of imagination. The corollary to just stubborn.
Well, it's great to discover new writers. And for instance, Lynn Hegenian, I found some poems in a magazine, and contacted the editor of the magazine to get her address and ask her for some work. And that's a great pleasure. And also, it's, having a press or a magazine, gives you a community. When you write, you are sitting by yourself, and with you and the page. But you do one of these things, and you meet all the poets you admire and like, and so it's a very nice antidote, a very nice balance to writing. Also making tangible objects rather than just words.
I think when Burning Deck was doing its chapbook series, Lynn Hegenian's Tumba was running almost parallel on the West Coast in that community of what became known as language-centered writing, but wasn't known much of yet as something like that. Kate Colby, before the event, was saying that spending time with the Wave Book was like having this deep immersion in pre-internet culture, when literary value really was made by these communities of exchange that you practiced with presses like The Figures or Away Day, or going forward, Omnidon, or whatever happened to Avec, the publisher of the great trilogy of Keith's works. And so I guess it indicates an attitude towards how you make value, though, too, because it didn't seem deferential towards the handful of New York publishers who determined what was important about poetry. It seemed more like, we'll figure that out.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, also, as Keith always said, nobody is publishing us, so we must publish ourselves. So that, so you start a magazine, or a press. By the way, I'd like to put a footnote to Jacques Roubaud, because he has a great saying that is always sort of my motto. He says, you can always go farther, but not always step by step, which I think is maybe the one recipe for writing poetry. You can't do it step by step. You have to leap.
From my limp, I made my leap. Somewhere. Yeah. Other folks you want to note from the Providence community? I think of the people who lived on the top floor of your house, Ray Ragasta, and before him,
Tom Ahern.
Tom Ahern. One of them almost burnt the house down, I think.
It's true.
Fortunately, it didn't quite burn.
Yeah. Well, it was a nice community of young writers around there, and very, very stimulating, very comfortable.
It's one reason we chose to come to Providence, because people said Providence has this really great poetry scene for the size of town it is. And when we lived there, we had Peter Gizzi on one side of the street and Leanne Brown on the other, and Mark McMorris up the block, and it was walkable, and you could smoke and talk and not work very hard beyond what your stipend was. You say somewhere in your memoir that graduate school was less miserable back then.
Oh, much. Yeah. We had a good time. There wasn't that, We were worried we might end up with a job in some God-forsaken place that wouldn't have a bookstore or something. Yeah. But we were not afraid of not getting a job at all. Yeah. Whereas now people are afraid of never getting a job, and it makes for an anxiety, and it makes for a premature professionalism, because they all feel the pressure to be at all the conferences to give papers. Whereas Keith produced plays, you know.
In which academic degrees were sometimes mocked.
That's right. But only his own. And, we played. Mm-hmm. Whereas graduate students now don't seem to have the chance to play the way we did.
Interesting. The play ethic. Is there knowledge in the room that we'd like to tap into here? I think there are 2 floating mics. They don't actually float, they're walked to you. Earlier this spring in March, Ugly Duckling Press did a big event celebrating Burning Deck. Toasts were raised, and Ben Lerner told his dreams about Keith and Rosmarie, and now with this event, it feels, with Wave Book representing their work, it just seems like an interesting continuity of independent press work that's really valuable. Questions for these 2?
I just wonder if you can recall a little bit, I think it was in one of the memoirs, about the field of printing presses that you came across, possibly in southeastern Massachusetts. It was like an old car lot just filled with old presses. And then I wonder if you could also just talk about how you had your own literal press with typeset, movable type in the basement, and how you worked at that. The mechanics of how you, maybe the early days of Burning Deck.
Okay. Keith wanted a magazine. We were in Ann Arbor, we were graduate students. He went to various printers to get estimates. They were way beyond what we could afford. So he decided, his solution was, we will do it ourselves. And I immediately, I was just come from Germany, and I said, how are you going to do it yourself? You're going to apprentice yourself to a bookseller? To a printer?
The best idea I ever had, and it got the most immediate. He said, you're crazy, it's out of your head, forget it.
But he prevailed, and it happened to be the moment when all the print shops were going from letterpress to offset printing, and you could buy a letterpress for a song. We bought, for $100, we bought a small press with all the accoutrements and things. So this literal printing press came into our house, and of course we didn't know how to do it. And, I said, this is madness, how are you going to do this? And he said, well, we'll get a book. So he went to the library and got a book on printing. And we started reading, and it said things like, lock the form into the chase with the coin. And we didn't know what any of this meant. So he said, well, it's too high a level. We need to get a high school level book of it. And he found one, and that explained all the terms, and so we actually learned it. And we started printing, and it was pretty messy, I must say. And it took some people saying, use less ink, do this, do that, And so, but just mostly by trial and error and a few helpful comments like that we started painstakingly setting type for these poems. And I must say, that was probably my other great lesson in poetry. It taught me to be very lean. Because once you set every letter, you are very aware of any little fat in any poem. So So this fortuitous technological moment, made it possible for our press, and was also the reason why there were so many other presses starting around that time in the early 60s. And so, supplanting the desperate mimeograph magazines that were just before. Yeah.
Hi. Is this on? Yeah. So I just wanted to add a footnote that I remember the first time I came across Rosmarie's poetry, I was working on a general humanities magazine at BU called the Boston University Journal, and the editor was Kurt Ackerman, who was the chair of the German department, and he chose as his associate editor Harriet Watts, who was a good friend of Rosmarie. So Rosmarie submitted some poetry, and I got to be the first reader, and I worked on that magazine for close to 5 years, and of all of the submissions in poetry that we received, it was Rosmarie's that struck me the most. I remember the day that we got it.
Wow.
I do. I remember sitting at my desk and opening the envelope and reading it, and I didn't know who she was at the time, but I knew her sensitivity to language and her honesty were just something great. And I think from then on, she and Keith both became honorary poets of the German department at Boston University.
Thank you very much.
I don't know how to ask it exactly, but from the ground, from the lawn. But just about this vast amount of time that you've spent in Providence, and I guess almost the sedimentary aspects of all the different eras you've passed through there. I'm just curious about which sort of which periods stand out to you most as personally as transformative or catalyzed by different people. From the 60s on, just if anything came to mind when I said that even.
That's a difficult question.
Large one, I know.
I think there was not
How
one.
many different Providences were there?
Quite a few, I think.
And were they dominated by specific people or by concerns? Were they dominated by the presence of certain people or by specific concerns that were a part of the time itself?
Mostly by people, I think.
people.
Well, one of the things was I didn't really teach very much. I only taught occasionally when people were on leave. I would get a visiting job, And but whenever I did it, I enjoyed it tremendously. And there was one graduate writing poetry workshop that I taught that had Peter Gizzi, Pam Rame, Brian Shorn, and Claire Niddell, and some other people. But those four, Brian Shorn and Claire Niddell, have gone off into other areas. But those four people were writing such incredible poems in that seminar that that was one of the most stimulating moments I ever had. And in fact, I was saying, I must write too. Why am I not writing myself? And yeah, or that objectivist seminar was another very stimulating one. I was sort of learning about them along with you, Sure. So I pretended to teach it, but that again was a good class, and well, he was in it,
On the Russian poets, somebody thought they were because of all the
That's
names.
right. Yes, so that was a student comment. I had a poster on my office door. And so there was, Reznikov, Zhukovsky, Rakuzi, and Oppen. And a student came in and said, are those all Russian poets?
Rosmarie, I have a question about Edmond Jabès. I love that story about the person pulling out the book in Paris. And I just would love to hear you both speak a little more about your dedication to publishing French and German translation, and especially experimental French and German work. And, a lot of the anthologies you've published are, new to you German authors, So I was just curious about, your literary exchanges with how that came about and your dedication to that.
Well, as Keith said, it came about mostly through the friendship with Claude Voyer-Genoux, Anne-Marie Albiach, and Edmond Jabès. And then Emmanuel Ocar, whom we met a little later. And actually, Emmanuel was better than any of the others at pointing out other new young French poets. Claude was always a little bit off in his own world, but Emmanuel always knew all the young writers.
He curated a series. He curated a reading series.
Right.
Can you? It was Emmanuel who coined the phrase "ooh la 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 la," as Edmond Jabès would say. From Lavish Absence, I wondered if you could give the voicing of that. This is something that print can't do. So Edmond, working on a plumbing project, says "ooh la 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 la," and then that becomes like a watchword in the group for when something. The first time Emmanuel Hocard comes to Jabez's apartment, Edmond is on all fours trying to repair something. Oh, la, 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 la. Emmanuel starts it, and soon we all comment on our problems. Oh, la, 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 as Edmond Jabès would say. But can I get your ooh, la, 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 la?
Yeah, it was more like oh, la, 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 la.
Keith, do you have a specific ooh, la, la, la?
Edmond claimed that if he weren't a poet, he would have become a plumber, because he said those two activities are quite related.
This must have delighted Keith, who never tires of that kind of humor. The Brownings. Yeah.
Right.
Hug the microphone. Since Creeley was important to you early on, I wonder if you could say anything about his time in Providence when you got to know him again, or differently.
Yeah.
We meant to do that.
Yeah. Well, actually, he wasn't very much around. He was constantly doing readings elsewhere. Yeah. But nevertheless, it was very good to have him. And for the time he was there, he was really there. He was really, his presence was felt. You know. And also, again, he was given some money, and so he immediately, I think he worked with Michael Gizzi on that to establish another reading series, to bring poets. And so even when he was out of town, his series was going on. So. Yes, it was great, but he also got sick very early after coming to Providence, and so it was not as good a stay for him as it might have been. Yeah.
We should talk about the other Robert as well, because you haven't been often on the West Coast, but meeting with George and Mary Oppen was an important moment in the West, and
yes.
You told me a great story about having a tour of Robert Duncan's home that I think would bear repeating in this context.
Yes, we were visiting, I guess we had a reading, and we were visiting Robert Duncan, and we, had a drink and talked nicely. And then he said, would you like to see the house? And we said, sure. And he said, we can also knock on Jess's door and see if Jess is available. And Jess was not available, but so he showed us all over the house, the paintings, the many records, many CDs, and but a lot of paintings, mostly Jess's, but also others. And so we had this very nice tour through the house, and then he escorted us to the front door. signaling the visit is over.
When we saw that great show in New York about the Duncan household and their art collection, it has that beautiful video that just runs. It's basically somebody's just videotaped what's on the walls. And that was the only time Jennifer and I had the impression of a house somewhat similar to yours. And I understand that Forrest Gander has made a similar movie of some of your house.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I'm going to have to ask you about Mary and George Oppen. When was that visit with them, and was it through Mary or through George that you were?
I don't really know. It must have been in the 80s.
Okay, so pretty late.
And George was beginning to have trouble. In the conversation, he was very conscious that he sometimes repeated himself. He would start to say something and then turn to Mary and say, "Have I already said this?" And it was very poignant and a little painful because he was saying beautiful things, but always with this, being unsure. Am I just repeating myself? And so Mary did actually most of the talking.
Keith said to me, "I don't think if you put all my days in San Francisco together, it would be longer than a week." So it shouldn't be too hard to narrow down. Yeah.
I was just hoping to ask you both about teaching and about the program at Brown and how it developed, what your goals for the educational climate there were, and what your goals in your classes were, what you wanted your students to experience in those spaces.
Yeah, that's for Keith.
I didn't catch that.
He's wondering about the writing program and how you felt about teaching and what your goals were in teaching.
The writing program was very helpful to me, at least as much as to the authors who were the students. But they mostly taught themselves. And they were. It took a certain courage to present themselves as we're writers now. We're going to be in this program, and once they'd crossed that line, it usually wasn't any great problem to keep them going. And some of them seemed interesting, and they disappeared afterward. And I haven't heard a word of them. I have no idea where they went or what name they use now or anything. But others. It seemed a time when they could burst out of not just just writing their own stuff and slamming the machine shut, but would actually get it out, and a number of them were turned out to be very interesting writers. They weren't all that interesting when they started, but some of them were. Some of them I thought, oh, this person is. Sometimes I thought this person is going to be great, and I never heard him again. But that's the way it goes.
Keith's goals for teaching were often apparent because when you walk into the living room, there's a long bench, and he would be reading for whatever he was going to teach next. So you would walk in, it would just be the stack of what he was going to do the next semester, whether it was Auden or 17th century. So, yeah. You also say in one of the interviews that you took up collage with a different intensity after becoming department chair or head of program or whatever it was. That's when you declared that midnight would be your time.
That's right. That's right. Well, people were always coming by.
Needing things.
Any time, day or night, and it was, in a way, that was what I would think would be the right thing, but it was too much. And so finally, I sort of put it out that I would be around until 10 o'clock at night, but after midnight, I wouldn't open the door. And the bell still rang occasionally, but but generally I didn't. Generally, I managed not to go to the door.
And were your visual collages mostly night work, or was that?
Pardon?
Were your visual collages mostly night work, or did you do that? I kind of think of you writing at night.
The visual things were done any old time, and not done. There wasn't a time when I think now I'm doing the visual collages, but there'd be a piece of something, and I think, oh, that would be good on a thing, and I'd slam it on and then I would not think about it for some time. Next time I came back, and I think, oh, that's curious. Maybe this would go with it, and some of them were built over weeks and weeks, and others were done because all of a sudden it all happened right, and it would be in 20 minutes I would have a new collage.
Siglio Press
But
published some of those.
But I didn't. I never decided. I'll do so many per such and such a time. And I thought, over this amount of time, maybe I'll do nothing. But on the other hand, if I see something that would go together, I'll put it together no matter what. And if it didn't go together, it went together, but it wasn't enough of it. Well, put it aside as a partial thing. And sometimes it later seemed more connected than I had expected, and other times I thought it really needed to. I really have to work on it to do anything at all. And,
I remember coming back from the flea market in Paris with you one day, and we were waiting in a metro stop, and you walked over to one of the posters and just clandestinely ripped off some of the. I might need that for my collage. I think we're getting near to last words, but Jennifer, did you have a question? Or?
Oh, I was going to tell the anecdote of him ripping off posters. And when you walked around in Paris, he was like stealing stuff for his collages, and you're kind of like, what's he doing? He's like ripping pieces of the poster. But I was just going to say, as a teacher, I felt like Keith, I feel like you were a stealth teacher, because he would never go at a critique or a suggestion straightforwardly, but suddenly, like, I'd find a book in my box with just a little note, like, and it was like the perfect book that I needed to read at that moment. And I thought, he's not paying attention, but then there would be these acts of incredible attention, but they were always stealth, They weren't about, like, I'm the great teacher and I'm going to tell you. It was more like you'd find these little notes to you. So it was always kind of subtle. And it wasn't like till 5 years later that I'm like, oh, my God, he totally influenced me. But how did he do that? So it's just, just in terms of his pedagogy, I thought it was very subtle and enduring. So that's great.
I did have one question about, but maybe we'll bring it around, but about friendships, and whether I was curious about your intergenerational friendships, which for me have been so powerful in my own life, and I see in evidence with your friendship here in this room with Steve and Jennifer. But I was also curious just about the friendships, whether you have solo friendships, or do you tend to form bonds together do you share friends? Is that part of almost a kind of collaging in a way?
We mostly share them. There are very few people that we would say, oh, well, he's Keith's friend, but not mine. No, we mostly share them. Actually, my sister-in-law once asked me about my friends, and she was very surprised that I didn't really have any separate friends that weren't also Keith's friends. But I guess she wanted to see some women bonding, you know. Yeah.
We talked a little last night, though, they're not, about how rare it was for us coming up to see an artist couple both fully realized within the same medium. We had seen some evidence of it across media, but not so much like two poets having that sense of, you know, working together and neither having to take the solo support role or something like that. So it's not something I don't think they call attention to, but I think when we were studying the world and just trying to figure out how can you care about this stuff with over some long length of time, what do you have to give up? And it seemed like they didn't think they had to give up their art for their companionship or vice versa.
Certainly not.
That Gale Publishing
Yeah, did you do?
venture
Yeah.
that you mentioned was amazing because it was the most conventional kind of product.
Yeah.
And yet the people who wrote
Ray wrote a great one.
their best pieces in it. It was Leslie wrote the most fabulous autobiography.
Oh, I don't know that one. Yeah.
It's great. The one person they said, we can't do this, it's too crazy, was Bob Grenier.
Of course. Thank you, Fanny. No, I think yeah. This has been very hospitable. Yes. Thanks for letting us into your living room, Arbor.
Thank you.